Okay, welcome back. In this, or to a pretty important lecture for the class. In this lecture, we're going to cover what's chapter 8 in the book, but we're only going to cover part of that, and that part is what we call Enterprise Discounted Cash Flow, or the DCF model. Right. So this is the meat and potatoes of the class. This is the most important lecture because it's the one that describes what actually valuation is and how we do it. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is, or what I'm going to try and give you in this lecture is a roadmap. Okay, there are going to be some things that we're going to gloss over a little bit because there is more detail that's necessary, and we'll go into that at a later chapter. So there's going to be some things where I just tell you what we do without really explaining it all the way. What I'm trying to give you here is the big picture, so that as we move through the rest of the class and you get more and more detail, your understanding of the big picture is enriched. Okay, so I've got to give you this roadmap so that you can at least know where we're going, so that when we start talking about details, they make sense. Okay? Now, if we were meeting in class, and I had the board in front of me and stuff like that, we would work out some more details. So we would spend some more time within the lecture going over some of the actual mechanics of the process, talking about formulas, things like that. In this format, I think that's, it just wouldn't work as well. It would be a little more wonky. So what I want to do instead is just truly treat this lecture as a roadmap. So it'll be kind of short. I will go over the main steps. I'll talk about all the things that we're going to do. And then in lieu of sort of interspersing the examples and the mechanics within the lecture itself, what I'm going to do is post alongside this lecture a video of me actually doing one of these in Excel. Okay, that way when I'm talking about the mechanics, we can be actually looking at them and doing them. Okay, so the way that I would like for you to treat this lecture, and that's why there's 2 weeks to cover chapter 8. There's lots of time here. Normally we do this lecture for a week, and then we do a model. We do the model in class all together on the screen. I'd be like writing it out instead of doing it in Excel. I actually think this might work better just in this particular setting because you'll be able to follow along in Excel and stop and start and see what's going on. So there's lots of time. The way I'd like you to work this is just to watch this. Hopefully it's a pretty short lecture. Again, it's a roadmap. Then go to the example and watch the example. And then I'm going to try to identify the key points in the example as I'm working that tie back to the lecture so that you get a big holistic picture of what's going on. Okay, this is admittedly a lot of information to try to take in 2 weeks. And I don't expect you to be an expert in valuation by the time we're done. Again, this is just the roadmap. This is just what we're going to do for the rest of the class. So don't try to come out of here being ready to do your own valuation model. Try to get the understanding of what goes into doing a valuation model. What are all the steps I need to accomplish? What are the things that I need to be looking out for? And then to the whole rest of the class, then the next 2 sections, the 2/3 of the class, that's when we're going to go through the details. How do I do this step exactly? What happens when this problem happens with this step? What happens when we see this detail? How do I overcome this kind of issue? And hopefully by the end of the class, you'll have been able to put all the more detailed pieces into the bigger roadmap and create and by then have a really good picture of actually how to do one of these. And of course, that's the goal. But your last 2 homeworks, you're going to be doing your own valuation, admittedly a simple one on a company that I just made up with all the numbers made up and everything like that. But you're going to be doing one of these. Okay, so this is the part where you start to understand what that means. So again, this is really important. So please ask for help if you find yourself not understanding a step, or you find that you think that I maybe that the logic in your head didn't jump the way that I described it. Then please come talk to me. Again, this is one of the most important parts of the class. Okay. So there are lots of different models that we can use to value companies. Okay? Now, there's a couple of important things that I want you to sort of keep in mind from the start of this lecture. The first is all the way back to our first lecture. Remember what it means to say something has value. Okay? So the value of anything is the present value of its future cash flows. Okay? Now, for some things that is ambiguous what those cash flows are, but for a company it's not. We can understand the cash flows produced by a company because a company is in the business of making money. They are selling a product or a service and they are generating revenue, right? And we talked about, that was what that whole first lecture was about, why revenue is not necessarily, even though it's the most obvious cash flow generated by a company, it's not necessarily the best cash flow to use when we're trying to understand what the company is worth, what its value is. Now we can use revenue and we can move through, and again, we covered this in the lecture, we'll cover it again in this lecture and subsequent ones, but we can use revenue to develop something called free cash flow, which is a much better and more appropriate cash flow to use in order to value a company. Okay, so we put that together, and what I want you to keep in mind is the way to value a company is to take the present value of all of the free cash flows of that company from now until infinity, or until the company dies, whichever comes first. Okay? Now, of course, every company's going to die. No company's going to live forever. So infinite cash flows are impossible, right? But the math, and we won't go into too much detail there, but the math works better if we treat those cash flows as infinite than it does if we try to assume the death date of a company. Okay, so I'm going to get a better measure, true measure of value if I say assume the cash flows go on forever, than if I say assume the company dies in 15 years. Because I don't know if the company's going to die in 15 years. I know for sure it won't go on forever, but the math works out better that way. And again, this is not a math class, so I won't go into detail why that's true. You're just going to have to trust me. Okay? So that's the first thing I want you to keep in mind. The whole goal of a discounted cash flow model is to get free cash flows for the future of the company. We want to try to estimate the company's future free cash flows. And free cash flows are a result of the company's revenues and expenses, of their investments in assets and their borrowing and loans and all the other financial aspects of the company. Free cash flow is whatever is left after the company has operated, generated revenue, spent any cash, and made any investments, and then whatever's left is called free cash flow. Okay? So this is the result of the company working. And what we're trying to do is estimate the future results of the company. And that is not a trivial thing. Right? So don't take that lightly. Now, once we do that, right, in the first lecture, again, what we developed was a model called the key value driver formula that described how we could take the present value of the free cash flows and come up with a number that was then the value of the company. Now, the one problem with that model is that, if you'll remember, it required that NOPLAT, right, that the cash flows were the same forever, right, or that they grew at a constant rate forever. And of course, if we think if we give any thought to how an actual company in the real world works, we would recognize that that is a restriction that is too limiting for us, right? So companies are not going to generate the same cash flow or even a cash flow that grows at a constant rate or anything like it forever, right? So the problem for us is that we made this nice model, but that model is only true under really nice circumstances, and the real world is not nice, and the circumstances that underlie companies' behavior in the real world is not nice. Okay? So we have two things now, right? One is we know that we need to estimate the future free cash flows for the company. Two is we know that those future free cash flows are not going to be the same, and they're not going to be growing at the same rate, or shrinking at the same rate, or growing in some kind of nice pattern, changing in some kind of nice pattern. They're going to be more or less random. Okay? So as we predict the future behavior to try to estimate the future cash flows, that is where all the work is coming in this model, right? Once we are finished estimating the future free cash flows, The rest of it is just math, and Excel is going to do the math for us. So that part is going to be easy. We're just going to click solve and boom, we're done. Okay? The hard part is in trying to think really deeply about the company's behavior and its future choices so that we make the best estimate of future free cash flows that we can. Okay? Now, there are lots of kinds of models to aid us in this general goal. They don't all use free cash flow as the cash flow that they are taking the present value of, but they all operate on the same basic idea, which is that the present value of the future cash flows gives us the value of the company. Okay, so the one that we're going to do, and the one that you just have time to cover one in one class. So we're going to cover the Enterprise Dcf model because this is probably the best model. It's certainly the most common. This is the one that everybody will talk about. We will give some discussion to the next two models here on the list, the discounted economic profit and the adjusted present value or APV model, because those are probably second and third most common. The book has a more detailed discussion of all five and of the last two that we won't really talk about at all, except to say occasionally I'll talk about the equity cash flow model because it is appropriate when we're talking about valuing specific things. So it's not that these other models don't have uses, it's that their uses are more specific. For instance, the equity cash flow model is really useful only when you're valuing banks and other financial institutions. But we wouldn't really use it if we were going to value a more standard company. And for instance, the adjusted present value model is really useful when we have a company where we expect that the capital structure is going to be changing drastically in the future, right? So if the reason we're doing the model is perhaps because the company is going to undergo some kind of complex financial transaction, like a leveraged buyout or a big merger, then the adjusted present value model may be a little bit better because it allows us to deal with a changing capital structure more easily than the discounted cash flow model. Okay, so these other models, they're not useless, but they are they do have more specific use cases. And so because this class is, again, we don't only have so much time on our hands. We're just going to stick with the main model, and then hopefully I'll sort of at certain points bring up where in cases where these other models might be more useful. And if you're interested, again, I can't recommend the book enough. And the book has a lot more detailed discussion of how these other models differ, right? And you can see that one of the ways that they differ is that they use a different measure of cash flow, right? So we spent the whole first lecture talking about why free cash flow is really the best measure, but we talked about that in a very general way about a very general firm. Some specific firms, again, like banks, free cash flow isn't the best measure. And so there are other models to do such things. Okay? In theory, all of these models should give us the same general answer, right? So if we were going to be as thorough as we possibly could, we could try to value a company using one or more of these models or all of these models and see how closely related the estimate of value that each of these models gives us is, right? And if we were all in the same area or the same range, then we might be relatively confident in our estimate. If we were widely apart, then we might have some guide or some intuition into maybe where we might have, what the differences are and why they and how they were caused, and maybe somewhere to go look, get more details.